It is my pleasure, really seriously, to introduce our tonight's speaker, Stephen Huston, who is a PCNS fellow and is the current um, treasurer of PCNS. And he's going to be talking to us about the money in the last years of Venice, the Republic. Take it away, Stephen.
Okay. Well, this start all starts off in 2002 when my wife Janet decided to take me on a European grand tour. We chose just three places because of the time, but they were all new to me: Paris, Florence, and Venice. And the 5 days we spent in Venice changed my numismatic collecting for the next 24 years. We visited the City Museum of Venice with its impressive coin collection for every doge who struck coins, filled dozens of cases in several rooms, and I left knowing that I would never collect Venetian coins. It was simply too much. It never occurred to me that I might end up collecting Venetian money from even later in the city's history. The real change for me came at a shop selling antique documents. The store was tiny, but in the front window display, there was a piece of paper which caught my attention. It appeared to be a 150-year-old piece of Venetian paper money. Now, I had bought and sold Venetian coins for decades, and I'd never even heard of Venetian paper money. Also, it was dated 1848, which I knew was half a century after the end of the Venetian Empire. Was this some kind of a tourist scam, or was there more to Venetian monetary history than I knew? I went inside and inquired, and the proprietor brought out a small wooden drawer with examples of several different denominations of this money. I learned it was the official currency issued by Daniel Mannon's government during the 1848-49 revolt against Austrian rule. I selected the best example he had of each of four denominations and left his shop with my new collection. As far as I knew, I now owned a nice example of every denomination issued by this short-lived revolutionary government. I thought I had bought a full collection. I was wrong, but now I had a new collection interest, and I had no idea of the can of worms I'd opened. So first, we'll start with a little short history of Venice. The beginnings of Venice are tied to ancient Rome. Here is a map of Italy from the time of Caesar Augustus. The Venetian lagoon lay in a Roman Italy that he called Venetia et Istria. He set this up around 7 AD to keep track of the regions of his empire. The Venetia region spanned the North Adriatic Sea, including the Venetian lagoon and its nearby terra firma. The Roman people believed that the people of Venetia were direct descendants of refugees from ancient Troy. The lagoon area at that time included no cities, no towns, no villages. It was simply a bay on the Adriatic in the new area. There was basically no population in the area around the lagoon. However, the lagoon's Lido stretch provided a beachfront and sea access, and the lagoon had good fishing. And there were over 100 low-lying islands and mudflats in the lagoon. For the wealthy Romans, this area, located due north of Rome, offered a seasonal getaway from the city. Most Romans knew of Venetia as a region, even if they didn't have a home there, and almost nothing changed about the lagoon area for the next couple hundred years. Then, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, barbarians reached the Western Roman Empire. This included the Huns, Vandals, Visigoths, Lombards, all the barbarian tribes looking for land gold, plunder, and power. And as they reached the heart of the empire in the west, they headed toward Rome, which they knew was the capital. Roman subjects of all classes in Italy feared for their safety as the Romans came through, and they fled to the countryside, including Venetia. The refugees built homes, the population grew, and the larger islands developed into villages. Some were near enough to each other to connect with bridges, but most remained reachable only by boat. The lagoon was also slowly silting up from the rivers emptying into it, and the Lido area protected the lagoon from erosion by tides and currents. The lagoon's isolation provided security from ongoing attacks, and many of the settlers or refugees made it their permanent home. They were generally left in peace. In early Venice, any money which reached the lagoon area was of Roman types, but by the beginning of the Dark Ages, all coinage was becoming very scarce. And the Venetians did not strike their own coins in these early centuries. Any monetized transactions were calculated or recorded in the Roman denarius, which remained the money of account throughout the region of the Roman Empire, even after coins completely disappeared. Then, in the early 800s, the heirs of Charlemagne struck a large silver denarius coinage bearing the names of the regions in their kingdoms. This included an issue by Louis the Pious for Venetius. Though the coins appear to bear the name Venice for the first time, they were not struck there. The name simply refers to the region that was part of the kingdom. It's not referencing the city in the lagoon itself. Venice continued to grow, and the residents living in a natural bay gradually took to seafaring, shipbuilding, and trade. They established profitable trade routes around the Mediterranean and became the most profitable port in the Western world. Venice was often the first port that traders sailing from the Middle East to Europe would go to, and they would stop there to unload their cargo. The Venetians used their own fleets for trading along the European coast. They would sell goods, so the traders would sell goods at Venice and get a good price and could make a quick turnaround. And then the Venetians, acting as middlemen in the trade, would break up the arriving cargoes, remix them so that they could offer a variety of goods from a single ship and head off to the other European ports. The traders got a good price and headed east again for their next load, and the distribution of the goods along the coast of Europe was left to Venice. The profit from trade led Venice to strike their own coins late in the 12th century. So this is early coinage of Venice. It was a small silver denarius, which they called a denaro. And the central designs were a cross on one side and a bust of St. Mark on the other side, all within beaded circles with some small inscriptions around. They varied from 15 to 22 millimeters, and they stayed like this clear into the reign of Enrico Dondolo, who ruled as Doge from 1192 to 1205. But late in his reign, a crusade was launched to protect Christians in the Holy Land. Money was collected to fund moving the 30 to 40,000 armed men who were going to take part, along with their horses and gear. In theory, they were going from Europe to Jerusalem. The Crusades usually traveled by way of Constantinople and Turkey for well over 2,000 miles. But this crusade planned to go from Europe directly to Egypt to attack the Muslim rulers there, and then to turn up the eastern Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem. Now, on the previous crusade a few years ago, Frederick Barbarossa had led that. There's a bust of him and a picture of one of his coins. But he died crossing a river in Turkey. This time, the Crusaders were hoping that a sea route would be safer. So in 1201, the Crusader leaders approached the greatest navy of the Western world, Venice, asking them to transport 33,000 crusaders from Venice to Egypt. Venice agreed, but they pointed out that they'd need a bigger boat. Actually, they'd need a much larger fleet than what they'd been using for trade. They contracted for a new fleet and the provisions while the Crusaders waited in Venice for it to all be ready. About 12,000 members of the Fourth Crusade arrived in Venice and were greeted by the Doge. However, this 12,000 people who arrived was not 33,000 contracted. The smaller group of crusaders that arrived couldn't afford to pay for the contract that had been agreed. Doge Dandolo put the crusaders on an island and kept them there for months, demanding the rest of the money they owed. When he finally had all the money they had, Venice could afford to strike bigger silver and even gold coins. And then the Doge renegotiated the route the Crusaders must travel now that they were all but hostages of Venice. First, they would have to take the port at Zara for Venice. Then they would go on to Constantinople to restore a Venetian favored claimant to the Byzantine throne, who would then join them with his army and march on to Jerusalem. The Pope caught wind of what was up, and he forbade them from attacking any fellow Christians, which would have included both Zara and the current ruler at Constantinople. When they eventually sailed for Zara anyway, the Pope excommunicated the entire crusade. This isn't much of a crusade anymore. The Fourth Crusade, under the Venetians, reached the Byzantine capital in 1203, and they restored the Byzantine ruler they were sponsoring. But even after he took over, he was unable to fulfill his promises of paying the troops or getting troops to go on the crusade with them. So the Doge and the Crusaders talked among themselves and decided in the spring of 1204 to sack the capital. They took over Constantinople, and Venice, in their part with the agreement, got a quarter and a half. That's the way it was worded in the document. That works out to 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire and all its goods, including first choice of the treasures in Constantinople and control of numerous trade ports formerly under Byzantine rule. So the Fourth Crusade as a crusade was a complete failure. They didn't even reach the Holy Land. But Doge Dandolo considered it a success for Venice, although I'm not sure he actually thought of it that way because he was killed in battle. But Venice came out with new trade routes and enormous wealth. At that point, Venice now controlled trade throughout the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and wealth continued to flow into the city for several hundred years as a result of this trade. Then in 1453, Constantinople, what was left of the so-called Byzantine Empire, fell to the Ottoman Turks, and Venice started to lose control of its trading ports. Eventually, the Turks took over enough area that the Venetians only controlled the Adriatic coast. Trade profits declined dramatically, and wealthy Venetians began to move their investments from trade and ships to agricultural and land on terra firma. The decline of Venice's empire of the sea left it vulnerable in brand new ways that nobody alive had ever considered. By 1782, when Ludovico Manin was elected Doge, the Venetians had no clue he would be their last Doge. French revolutionary forces under Napoleon and Austrian forces under the Holy Roman Emperor Francis of Austria were warring across Europe, but they both had eyes on the Italian peninsula. Napoleon's forces took northern Italy, and they waited until they'd pretty much conquered everywhere except the hardest place to reach, Venice. In 1797, Napoleon finally reached Venice. He had already established himself as king of the cities previously controlled by Venice on the mainland. And the Doge and his council realized they could not defend the city against the French forces. Their merchant marine had shrunk to where they had less than 400 men. Their fleet numbered less than a dozen galleys, and their efforts to call for help from their allies around the Adriatic Sea failed to raise any meaningful response. On May 12, 1797, Doge Manon abdicated, and Venice surrendered to Napoleon. The Venetians didn't know that the French and Austrians had already signed a secret agreement that the Venetians knew nothing about, saying Napoleon would take the city and then trade it to Austria for other territories he preferred. The Venetian Republic was no more, and Doge Manon left the city for his estate on terra firma, unaware of what was going to happen next. The final coinage of the last Doge of Venice, Manon, shows the Doge kneeling before the banner of St. Mark. His name is around with the date 1797 in exurge. The reverse shows St. Mark's lion with an inscription around saying St. Mark in Venice. These are struck on irregular planchons of roughly 25 millimeters, and they weigh about 4 grams. It was apparently worth 1/8 of a silver escudo, which was the large crown. This was once Doge Manon's most common coinage, but examples dated in 1797 were probably only struck for a few weeks, and it took me many, many years to find this example. And that is the end of Venice, according to almost every history book written about the city. But all of those books are wrong. So what happened next? Here's a look back at the design of the silver ducats that Venice was striking before Doge Manon abdicated. It features St. Mark's winged lion standing over the city of Venice, and we're going to see this design come up again later, so keep it in mind. But first, I want to talk about the horses. Venice was very proud of the 4 horses that it had standing over the entrance to the Basilica of St. Mark on the main square of the city. Those horses were thought to have been the work of the Greek artist Lysippus from the 4th century BC. Under the Roman Empire, the horses were taken from Greece to stand over the Hippodrome in Constantinople, where they remained for hundreds of years, until the Venetians claimed them as war spoils during the Fourth Crusade. Venice took them back to their home, placed them in the front and center above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica as a show of their invincibility. They had conquered the Byzantine Empire. The horses remained there for nearly 600 years until Napoleon took them from atop the archway there and decided he wanted them for a new victory arch in Paris. So here's a engraving done at the time of the large horses being brought down into the plaza of San Marco so that they could be transported Paris. They were taken back and put atop a new victory arch that Napoleon had built. That arch still stands in Paris with the 4 horses on top. But the horses on top of it now are not the horses that Napoleon brought back. They are replicas of them that had to be created and put there after the French were forced to give the horses back as part of a treaty in 1805. And the city of Venice got its horses back. Now, the French managed to retake the city again under a treaty, but they didn't strip it again the next time. But under the French rule, the provisional government that had been set up struck some coins in 1797. This is kind of a flashback. I haven't been able to find one of these. But Napoleon did strike some low-grade silver and some high-grade silver, as well as some bronzes. The low-grade silver appears to be copper after it's slightly circulated. And all of the mintages of these, this is the 1801 piece, the mintages are completely unknown, but they are rarely seen in the market. Old catalog values suggest that there were never very many collectors of this series because while they appear to be quite rare, they don't carry a high value, but nobody's updated the values on them in the last 30 or 40 years. They simply predate most of the catalogs that are kept up. So far, I've only found this one piece from this series. Napoleon retook the Veneto region in 1804 and had himself crowned King of Italy in 1805. And he struck coins as King Napoleon using the mints at Milan, Bologna, and Venice. Milan and Bologna struck huge numbers of coins for him. Venice struck tiny issues. His largest silver, the 5-wire coin, was reportedly struck in Venice in 1807 and 8, but there's no mintage records of them and no sale records of those dates ever appearing in the catalogs. The only one that turns up occasionally is the 5-wire date of 1810 for Napoleon. According to the records, while the larger mints at Milan and Bologna struck millions of these, Venice struck 14,000. So the Venice mint mark is exceedingly rare in this series. And it's probably a bargain because the dealers who occasionally see them treat them as common portrait coins of Napoleon, and they don't find current catalogs on them, so they price them all the same regardless of mint. If you find one with the V mint mark, grab it. It's probably really a good deal if you care. Napoleon also struck bronze coins at Venice as king. Again, the mintages for this type from Milan and Bologna are many millions each, while Venice struck much smaller numbers. So this is the one centesimo denomination from Venice. I have only ever managed to acquire 2 examples of this bronze coinage. After Napoleon's eventual defeat in 1814, Austria retook the region under a treaty and established the Kingdom of Lombard Venetia. They continued running that area from 1814 to 1866. They minted at the same coins that they struck for the Austrian Empire, but with a slightly different reverse inscription and the mint mark under the arms to indicate which mint had struck it. All 4 mints had large outputs in 1862, but there's no records of the mintages prior to that. And early dates from Venice are seemingly impossible to find, while the other mints are all fairly plentiful in the marketplace. But you have to ask for them. Nobody displays them or offers them because there's no collectors for them, as far as I can tell. Now, in 1848, there was a popular revolution against the Austrian rule. And in Italy, this favored Italian unification and the throwing out of the Austrians. There was an uprising in Milan, and the Austrians fled that city to escape. In Venice, trouble had actually started even earlier. In 1844, there was a failed revolution, but it had struck a spark and ignited a revolt that continued in the lagoon area. In January 1849, still under Austria, the Venetian Daniel Manin spoke to the public assembly urging the city to declare independence. So the Austrians arrested him. His imprisonment inflamed the protesters, and the Austrians suddenly faced actual riots in the city. In response, the Austrian government released Manin on March 17th, and the public hailed him as their new leader, and the unrest grew instead of settling down. A few days later, Manin led a march to the arsenal on March 22nd. That was where the Austrians kept their armaments. They evicted the Austrians, took over the armaments, and proclaimed the Republic of San Marco in Venice. The Austrian government, being faced by armed rioters now, withdrew from the city a few days later and left Venice. This is an Italian bronze medal commemorating Manin's release from prison. However, due to the destructions that had been caused by both Napoleon and Austrian reign for several decades, Venice had no navy, only private small boats for navigating the lagoon area. They were completely ill prepared to survive if Austria retaliated. Austria eventually realized that they could besiege Venice, cut off supplies and arms, and wait them out. They first cut off the land routes so that supplies couldn't reach them from via the mainland, the simplest route into Venice. But the lagoon was still open to the sea. And the new republic realized that they needed cash money, gold and silver, to pay blockade runners to bring them supplies so that they didn't starve. Many Venetians held gold and silver in private hands, but the Republic needed it in the public hands to pay for supplies. They hit upon the idea of issuing paper money, which could be used as cash locally. The trick was to persuade Venetians to hand over their silver and gold in exchange for this paper. Basically, it was a test of their patriotism to the new Venetian Republic. But it worked, and it gave Manin's government real money to buy supplies from outside the lagoon. And the public accepted the paper currency as a receipt for what they gave and used it in circulation since the rest of the money was gone. While the actual gold and silver was being used to secure food for the besieged citizenry, small denominations of 1, 2, 3, and 5 lire circulated. They were printed uniface, with each denomination slightly different in design and size, although they were all of pretty much the same size. They measured from 69 to 80 millimeters in height and 110 to 120 millimeters in width. That's 2 3/4 inches by 4 inches for Americans. The plain reverses of all of these notes were stamped in red ink with the official seal of the Republic. It prominently featured the Lion of St. Mark. We've seen that one before. I enlarged this one so it'd be easy to see that design. And this paper that was called Moneta Patriotica carried fairly intricate designs for each denomination so that they could be identified in circulation. These are the original 4 notes I acquired in Venice. It's been 24 years since that day, and I have managed to add 1 duplicate of 1 denomination. That is all I've ever found of these notes. and I've had want lists out with the dealers for years. So I know that they're tough. There were also larger denominations, which rarely circulated, but they had the same legal status as currency. Uh, they were given to Venetians who contributed these large amounts of gold and silver in exchange for the monetary value of what they gave to the government. Most of the holders of the large notes considered them a loan to the government. These were their receipts. In fact, that was the theory behind the issuing of all of the paper money. So the 50 and 100 notes were held as stores of value rather than being spent. And the 100 note here measures 117 millimeters by 172 millimeters. It's roughly twice the area size of the smaller circulating denominations. These were printed multicolored and uniface. And though uniface, each note was individually blind embossed in an empty corner rondelle with the seal of the city. I've circled that area in this one to make it obvious where the seal is. I acquired this note about 15 years ago, and it is the only example of a large denomination that I have seen in all those years. The dealer who had it priced it at several times the supposed catalog value, but I realized that that catalog hadn't been updated in decades because there were no records of sale during that time. So all Venetian paper money from these series are extremely rare. I know that well after 24 years of actively searching for them. Now, Venice had its own mint, and it had had a mint since the 12th century. They called it the Zecca. This building was completely rebuilt in the 1530s. It's that building right there. And both the Austrians and Napoleon used it for coinage. The new Republic of San Marco used it to coin the gold and the silver collected from their paper money so that they could pay suppliers with good coins of the city instead of having to work out some kind of a deal for a hodgepodge of foreign or obsolete coins or raw bullion. Now, the Zecca struck gold and silver coins here. This 15 centesimi was struck of 229 fine silver, which is fairly low grade. It's the size of a US dime, but obviously of poorer silver quality. They were intended primarily for local circulation. Note underneath the lion, there is a small ZV, which is the mint mark for Zecca Venetia. I managed to acquire 3 of this type over the years. One of them is hold, possibly as a charm or keepsake, and another is so heavily worn it shows no silver at all, probably kept as someone's pocket piece, saved as a souvenir. The 25-cent coin was also struck, but in 900 fine silver, and most of those probably disappeared in the external trade for supplies. I've never seen one of those offered. The largest silver was the 5-wire crown-size coin struck in 900 fine silver. This specimen carries the full name Venetia in exurge underneath the lion instead of the simple ZV mint mark. There's that lion design again. I own this piece. However, since they cost hundreds of dollars each, I have passed up on the few others I've been offered. My specimen supposedly has surface hairlines on the obverse and tiny peck marks on the reverse, but I think these are actual artifacts from the underlying foreign coin type that was sold to the government for paper money and then used as a blank planchet to be overstruck at the Zecca. There was also another obverse design which does not have the lion on a pedestal. So far, I haven't managed to acquire one of these, although they turn up in European auctions occasionally. It's a nasty place to have to bid for a European coin if you're an American collector. They also struck 20-wire gold coins in 900 fine gold. I don't have one of these, and I doubt that I'd be willing to pay for one if it did surface. This image is a rephotographed piece from a 44-year-old black and white catalog, which estimated the value 44 years ago at over $1,000. Virtually all of the precious metal coinage was exchanged to bring supplies into the city, and once those coins left the lagoon area, they were gone. They were taken elsewhere and recoined into the local coinage in the 1800s, or melted down as bullion in the 20th century. In 1849, with all of the precious metals exhausted, Venice decided to issue copper coins. These were used just for the local economy because Venice was being thoroughly cut off. So the 1849 coppers are fairly scarce. I've never seen the 1 and 3 centesimi coins offered. This is a 5 centesimi coin, the largest one they struck, about the size of a US quarter, but in bronze. And it's the only denomination for this date that I have found in decades of looking. I've managed to acquire 3 of them. 2 of them are in decent shape, and 1 is very worn. Again, probably someone's souvenir pocket piece. In 1849, the Austrians figured out how to blockade the entire lagoon and cut off supplies. With dwindling food, the Venetians waited while the Austrians bombarded them with cannon fire and aerial bombs. As summer progressed, the food supply ran extremely low throughout the city, and then cholera broke out. The Venetians couldn't even bury their dead, so corpses were left in the homes with the surviving family members to wait out the siege. Austria was firing about 1,000 cannonballs per day into the city, and the Venetians collected them and used them as doorstops in their homes. However, by late August, the leaders of the local government decided they were going to have to surrender. There was no point in everybody dying of starvation or cholera. But Daniel Manin decided to actively negotiate a treaty of surrender on August 24th, and he was able to avoid an unconditional surrender. The Austrians made concessions because they wanted it over as well. One of the concessions they made was to redeem the paper money. The Austrians agreed to do that at a discounted face value, but this may be the only time in history that an emergency money issued by a defeated government was actually redeemed by the victor after the war. The deal required that all paper notes to be redeemed must be presented on one day in San Marco Square, where the Austrians would pay for them and burn them as they were redeemed so that nothing could be claimed or used later. The few notes that have survived for collectors probably represent small denomination souvenirs saved because the amounts were not worth taking Austrian coin for them, or larger denominations that had been mislaid or hidden and were eventually discovered by heirs or survivors who missed the redemption date. And that's why they're all quite rare. Under Manin's treaty with Austria, he and a few other leaders agreed to abandon the city of Venice themselves and go into permanent exile. The deal was that if they did this, there could be no reprisals against the Venetians. The Austrians agreed, and on the day of the official handover and the monetary redemption, Manin left for Paris, where he remained a force for Italian unification until his death in 1857. When Austria eventually ceded Venice to the United Kingdom of Italy in 1866, the Italians immediately began plans to return Manin's body home to the Basilica of San Marco. And the Campo Manin was designed with a statue of him with St. Mark's lion surrounded by a lot of cannonballs. Now, after the revolt, the Austrians did use the Venetian mint again. They struck coins there in 1852 and 1862. This 1862 coin for the Lombardo Venetia area carries the V mint mark below the Austrian arms on the obverse. And to the best of my knowledge, the coinage shown here is the last issue of coins ever struck at the Venice Mint. I'm still actively collecting Venice from 1848 and 49, but as with any collection specialty, after the first 25 years, it gets much harder to find things you don't already have. I continue to buy things I already have if they're affordable, but I would like to complete my 1848 paper money denomination set by finding the 50 lira note, but nobody I know has ever seen one. I may have to go back to Venice and poke around for stuff. Thank you for watching. Here's some of my most recent sources. I'm not going to wait for you to read them all. You can look them up in the video later. But this isn't all I used. I've been reading everything I could get my hands on about Venice for the last 25 years.
Yeah.
In addition to the photos I took of my own collection, I want to give a shout out to CNG, Classical Numismatic Group, and some others who have made many useful images available for educational use through their Creative Commons licensing, which I most often find via Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're really at the end.